When did you first become interested in your research on the JFK, relating to the JFK assassination?
Well, I wouldn't say that my research was related to the assassination so much as Kennedy's foreign policy. That goes back to the early 80s and became much more specifically focused on his Vietnam policies when I did my doctoral dissertation at GW in about 1985, 1986. That's when the work began.
And what's your area of, these are somewhat obvious questions, but what's your area of specialization or the focus of your research in general, and perhaps currently, if there's some of that you can talk about?
Well, primarily it's been the foreign policy of the Kennedy administration. My doctoral dissertation, my first work was JFK in Vietnam. Right now I'm following up with a book called Kennedy in Cuba, where I'll focus on our Latin American foreign policy under Kennedy. Also recently I've spent a great deal of time going through the CIA files on Oswald, and I'll probably do something, publish something on that, not book size, but that remains to be determined.
Okay. What do you feel is your most significant accomplishment or contribution to understanding of the JFK, not necessarily the assassination case, but in terms of JFK in Vietnam, perhaps discoveries that you've had or conclusions you've arrived at that are new, that you're proud of some work that you've done relating to that? Is there any one thing that stands out?
Well, yeah, certainly in the Vietnam arena, the thesis of policy reversal between Kennedy and Johnson, that Kennedy was withdrawing us from Vietnam and that Johnson changed that policy, that I defended that thesis at the doctoral level, which is the first time that was done successfully. So we're out of this sort of sub-literature realm and into the realm of real academics with this. And there are several fora that have already been held and are going to be held this year and next year on these issues. It's now I feel like I've brought this question into the accepted realm of academia. In the context of the current work I'm doing on the CIA files, I think that the contribution I'm going to be able to make there is to take us a little farther down the road on this crucial question about whether or not there was a relationship between Oswald and the agency.
Does that also include the possibility of his interaction with military intelligence agencies such as DIA or ONI or any of the other alphabet soup intelligence agencies at the time, or are you basically focusing on Oswald and the CIA?
Okay, you have to understand that with respect to theories about the assassination and Dealey Plaza and these sort of things, I am not expert in that area, and I may have read some books, but I've certainly done no research, no primary research, so I'm coming at this subject from the point of view of reading the CIA files. In the files that I have read, I've spent about the last 4 or 5 months doing that. I haven't seen anything in there so far that would indicate any relationship between Oswald and military intelligence agencies. I am very intrigued at some of the documents and people I'm talking to, however, on this, as I said, on this question of possible contacts between Oswald and the CIA. And that research is ongoing, by the way, so I don't have any specific comments I want to make at this time on that.
Okay. Why do you think this case is so important 30 years later?
Well, it isn't this case anymore. I believe I was listening a little bit to your interview with Dan Alcorn, and I would underscore what he said. For me, and I think for a lot of people, it goes beyond who killed Kennedy and why. Not that that isn't important. What we're talking about now is reestablishing the faith of the American people in their institutions, and that was the point of this legislation. And if there's any improprieties here in the way that these files are released, not enough being released, things being withheld that shouldn't be withheld, I think it's going to destroy the whole aura that seems to have been building over the last year of let's let the chips fall where they may.
Now, I know in your first book you focused on one very interesting aspect of the policy reversal of Lyndon Johnson relating to Vietnam, and in the work you've done since then, I know it was debated by other pundits in the media challenging you about certain aspects of that. you think there's any hope of conclusively deciding whether or not, from the available evidence, whether you can connect that in any way with the motivation, the motive of the assassination of John F. Kennedy?
Well, certainly not in a way that would stand up in a court of law. Inasmuch as there are no documents that I'm aware of in any case. I mean, there are some documents we don't have yet, but I would certainly be very surprised if there was a document linking any policy aspect, be it Vietnam or Cuba or anything, to a motive to kill him. So what you're talking about is theorizing and circumstantial evidence at best.
Okay. Now, I know that your area of specialization is Vietnam for the most part. I know you're studying Oswald now, so perhaps in what you've seen lately or the other information you've availed yourself, do you have any opinion as to whether there is strong evidence suggesting that there was a conspiracy involved in assassinating John F. Kennedy? Do you think that itself can be determined, let alone who did it? But do you feel, from what you've seen, that there was a conspiracy involved in the assassination?
Well, a seat of the pants guess would be yes. But the real honest answer to that question from me is I don't know. I know that's not satisfactory, but I really don't.
No, that's a good answer, because the more information I take in, the less I can be certain of anything about this case, because it just leads you in all sorts of directions. After the Stone film, there was a furor about the releasing of the files, and we've just seen quite a bit of it released, and quite a bit of it is still withheld. And I know that there are ways to identify what has still been withheld. Of the still secret files, which are the ones that you'd most like to get to see?
Well, I'll answer that question in two parts. First of all, with respect to Vietnam material, there are files that I don't know that are even going to be considered under this legislation that I think properly should be if one will try to cover this base of policy mechanics nexus, which I don't necessarily subscribe to. But even if there's no connection, I want to see the documents relating to the Honolulu Conference of 20 November 1963, where plans to escalate the war were discussed that were clearly not in line with the policies that Kennedy had been pursuing that fall. And there were a number of other issues, Vietnam issues, over the course of 1963, some planning at lower levels for escalation, some which appeared to be undercutting his withdrawal plans, that are still classified, that are still being withheld. So I would like to see full disclosure in that arena. I think also in the area that I'm beginning to work in now, Kennedy and Cuba, the largest amount of material in the Kennedy Library that's being withheld all relates to Cuba. That stuff needs to come out. With respect to these files that the CIA has released, the first 22 boxes alone, which have been in the archives since March, April of this year, I personally had copied each withdrawal sheet, and the withdrawal sheet corresponds to a document that's been taken out. So, not addressing the issue of what records groups have not yet been released, but addressing only what has already been released and is over in the archives now, first 22 boxes. The stack of withdrawal sheets that I copied is about 2 inches high. And it's a rough guess, but I would estimate that there are approximately 3,000 to 4,000 pages missing that have been withdrawn out of the boxes the CIA has put over there. There are examples of documents that are in there that are totally redacted, i.e. totally black pages with only the classification left. I am not happy that this is the new openness that former Director Gates talked about. I'm very happy to see that the President finally appointed at least 4 people on the review board so that we can get about the business of demarching that review board and saying this is not good enough. We're not asking for all sources and methods, but thousands of pages still missing is not a go. So that's a long-winded answer, but there are things missing in other records groups, and there's a lot missing from what they're quote, releasing, unquote.
Now, the Cuban-related papers in the Kennedy Library, which agencies control, if any, would that fall under?
All of them. To declassify any document requires that those agencies that were involved in its origination or coordination especially its origination, be contacted prior to declassifying it. So we're talking about a lot. If we use the normal declassification procedures and time schedules, we're talking about a long, long time.
Now, I noticed recently, I saw a news article that the CIA has decided and has announced that soon they'll be releasing files from about 1950 to 1963 in accordance with Gates's supposed openness policy of anything 30 years old and older. And in that is supposed to be what the CIA has on the Bay of Pigs. Do you think that the Bay of Pigs files will shed light on the circumstances of both the two areas that I think you're in, previously the policy reversal in Vietnam and how that relates to the assassination, and also I lost my train of thought.
Well, let me just...
Bay of Pigs files give us shed light on the Kennedy assassination, do you think, in your opinion?
I don't know, but they will shed light on what was going on in the Kennedy administration at the policy level. And we don't have all the facts, and clearly the decisions surrounding the Bay of Pigs and the failure went a long way to establishing a hostile environment in the Kennedy administration between senior decision makers, especially between the president and some of his senior advisors. In that context, it may be helpful, but I can't be sure. I'm very heartened by this release that you've mentioned, however. I think it's very significant that we're going to get, according to what I've been reading in the newspapers, all the, quote, Cold War, unquote, files that the CIA had through roughly about 1962. I'm not sure that 63 is included, but we'll see. Anytime files are released, as an historian, I'm a happy camper.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, in terms of the JFK assassination, not necessarily the Vietnam issue, and this is an uncomfortable question for some people, but because they feel they'll leave people out. But who do you feel has done some of the better work on the case in terms of our current level of understanding of the assassination? What other researchers do you think have done some good work that come to mind that you admire, perhaps?
Well, in my book, JFK in Vietnam, I mentioned Peter Dale Scott, not for his work on the assassination, but for his early work, without having seen a lot of the documents on some of the presidential orders concerning Vietnam policy. With respect to the assassination, I really can't answer that question. My general opinion of the research is not a high one. There's not been, there's no grants. We've suffered from lack of evidence and documents. There's a lot of backbiting and invective between assassination researchers. For a number of reasons, I think that the end product, as looking at it as a total product, has been rather poor. And this Posner book will make a certain contribution in knocking down some of the sillier things that have been published over the years. On the other hand, I think you have to give some credit where credit is due. There was a lot in being selective. There are a lot of points that are very valid. Criticisms of what the Warren Commission did, criticisms of what the House Select Committee did, and I think to be fair, that probably most of the researchers can share a little credit on that score.
Now, do you have an opinion on whether there would be anything served by having another investigation on the assassination of JFK?
Well,
do you have any position on that?
I don't really. I don't have a position on that. I think what we need to do now is to work with the federal agencies, and work with NARA, the National Archives and the Records Administration, and work with the relevant committees, both in the Senate and the House, with what's going on right now, this process. We've never had anything like this before, and I know that people are in a hurry to find out the truth, whatever it is, but I think we would be better served to work with these files, and if it seems appropriate later on to take such an extreme measure, well then, fine, make a decision at that point.
Okay. All of these questions are redundant. I guess I'll go with my final question here now, and Some researchers love this, some hate it. Now, this case has been described as a hall of mirrors, and many times the journalists who do interviews with researchers are not very well informed, or they're confused, don't have a really very wide view of exactly the details of the case. And what I like to do at the end of each interview is throw it back to the researcher and say, if you were interviewing yourself, what do you think is important about the JFK case? What's a question that you wish a journalist would ask you? What's the heart of the matter?
Well, I mentioned it before. For me personally, it's why does it matter? Does it really matter if we pursue this anymore? A lot of people ask that. I don't get asked that by journalists. Journalists are always trying to get at your pet theory or whatever. But the case matters because it matters that we believe that our system works. And if we don't recapture that, there's going to be, and in fact, I would submit that the level of cynicism that exists now is very destructive. And that's really what counts for me. And I think if we put the focus on that, and if journalists would put the focus on that, we could get away from this black and white conspiracy or wiring commission version and get about the business of saying, fine, let's find out what happened and deal with the larger societal issues that have crept into this thing.
Okay. Now, I saw that you had some exchanges in the Nation with Alexander Coburn, and there's some controversy there. He doesn't seem to believe you when you say that the documents indicate that Kennedy was planning a withdrawal.
Yeah.
What's the firm evidence of that? And if you have to assume that Coburn has access to this, why is he coming to this total opposite conclusion and arguing with you about this when you can prove it with the documents?
Mm-hmm. Well, actually, Noam Chomsky has gone a lot farther than Coburn did. Noam Chomsky wrote a book called Rethinking Camelot, a great amount of which was devoted to my own work. Coburn was incredible. He reminds me of a stand-up comic when I read those passages in the Nation. Chomsky is a little more serious about it. The fact is Kennedy was withdrawing, and Noam will give me that. We have a presidential order. The issue, as Chomsky, I would say on the far left wing, and certain others who object to my thesis on the far right, is not whether Kennedy was pulling out. That's just an historical fact. The question is why? And now the issue is focused on, was he pulling out because he thought we were winning, or because he thought we were losing? And of course, Noam Chomsky is arguing he was pulling out only because he thought we were winning, and as soon as he faced the losing situation that Johnson faced, well, Kennedy would have done the same thing Johnson. So we can still disagree then. But this question of challenging the fact that Kennedy was pulling out to me is just hilarious.
Okay. Now, were you aware of Peter Dale Scott's early work when it came out, The War Conspiracy, in 1972, or did you discover his
No,
work
I saw it,
later on?
Well, not in 72. I would say probably in the late 70s I got a hold of that. Yeah, I was aware of Peter's early work.
Because I know he did some of the early work on the National Security Action Memorandum stuff in the Pentagon.
Yeah, Chapter 5 in the Gravel edition. It's very good.
Now, how can it be explained? I don't know what your approach is on this, but what I've seen you refer to as the black hole in the documents around the time of the Kennedy assassination in those Pentagon papers. There's virtually no reference to the Kennedy assassination, to the change of command to Johnson. What do you make of all that? Is that evidence that there's been massive destruction of files from that time period?
Okay, there is a lack of not a lack of documents. Documents certainly existed at some point, but they're no longer available, either missing or still classified, pertaining to our Vietnam policy during the summer and especially the fall of 1963. This gap is not just in the Pentagon papers. It exists across the board. In any collection, in any archive, we have this deficiency. Peter Dale Scott noticed this problem with respect to the Pentagon Papers, and has argued that perhaps there was deliberate manipulation of the Pentagon Papers, the people who were involved in putting that study together to hide something about that period. He knows more about the individuals involved than I do, know some of them personally. But I can say that he's right about that, and as I said, that deficiency or that lack of documents does exist across the board with respect to Vietnam policy in the fall of 1963.
Okay, we may be jumping around a little bit.
It's all right.
Do you know anything about, I've heard it rumored that General Douglas MacArthur advised JFK against sending troops, regular fighting troops, to Vietnam. Do you know anything about the story about that and how
Sure.
he may have influenced JFK's viewpoint on that?
Well, the story is well known. In fact, Kennedy did talk with MacArthur when he was first elected, and MacArthur warned him against doing anything like that. And there were discussions and arguments, some of them rather heated, in the first 2 years that Kennedy was president, over sending combat troops to Laos and to Vietnam. And Maxwell Taylor, who was his military representative at first, and then later his chairman of the Joint Chiefs, has told the story since that when the generals would ask Kennedy to send combat troops to Vietnam, Kennedy would say, "Now, gentlemen, when you can convince General MacArthur, that we should send combat troops there, that's when I'll do it."
Obviously, he had great respect for them. And a little bit more about the Joint Chiefs. And I don't know if your research has touched on this, but right before Kennedy died, there was a nuclear test ban treaty. And from what I understand, 4 out of 5 of the Joint Chiefs were violently against this treaty. Is there records in the documents of the Joint Chiefs relating to their opinions about that and their opinions about Kennedy going ahead and doing this against their advice? Is that a relevant area of study?
Oh, I think it is very relevant. I can't answer it because I haven't studied those documents. But I think understanding that these were the heyday years of the Cold War, and that there were sharp divisions over the extent, well, there was never any issue about whether we should oppose communism or communist advances in the Third World. President Kennedy believed that we should. The differences of opinion concerned how many places, how many resources should be used. So it would not be surprising, for example, to find that people in his administration had stronger views than he did, say, on disarmament or any number of issues. But I can't answer anything specifically on that.
Now, I know that you've pointed out in your lectures that many of what look like the key players here in your work, such as I believe Curtis LeMay, were Air Force people, and Colonel Burris, who was LBJ's military advisor, I believe, was also Air Force, and
Lansdale was
Air Force.
Sure.
And
Colonel Winterbottom and Mac VJ2, who was involved in the figure cutting, was an Air Force colonel.
do you have any opinion or any conclusions to draw from that? And were these people in communication with each other in the time of around 1963?
Well, that is taking a giant leap away from the facts and into the realm of theorizing.
I don't mean in relation to were they conspiring together, but did they have a relationship?
Well, LeMay, for example, I don't think knew very much about Lansdale. Lansdale, to get promoted, it took the head of the CIA, former head of the CIA, Allen Dulles, to help out. He was really a protege of Allen Dulles. Lansdale's Air Force services is more nebulous than his work for the CIA over the last several years while he was on active pay, working in Vietnam and in the Philippines and then back here in the Pentagon. Whether or not Colonel Burris knew, I doubt very much whether there was a personal connection there. Burris became important because he had a long association with Lyndon Johnson in Texas. Back in the 30s, Johnson pulled him off an oil rig and told him to join the Army Air Forces, and he did and became a bombardier in World War II. Had a long career, I believe, in intelligence work in Europe, was in Switzerland at the time of Kennedy's election, and was sort of literally pulled out of his job and what he was doing to come back and be Johnson's military representative.